They say a warrior never truly leaves the battlefield, but Master Sergeant Thomas Hawk Hawkins never imagined his next war would begin in his sister's peaceful suburban neighborhood. By the time the sun rose that fateful morning, 8 motorcycles lay burning in front of Oak Ridge High School, their riders in custody, and the man they called the Reaper learned a brutal lesson about the difference between intimidating schoolchildren and confronting a decorated Force Recon Marine. To understand how a quiet New England town transformed into a battleground, and how one retired Marine Corps veteran dismantled the most feared motorcycle gang in Massachusetts, we need to return to where it all started. Before we dive deeper into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy real stories of justice being served, make sure to stay with us until the end. Master Sergeant Hawkins stood motionless on his sister's front lawn, his enhanced prosthetic leg barely visible beneath his jeans as the autumn wind stirred fallen leaves around his boots. 22 years of Marine Force recon operations had honed his instincts to razor sharpness, and right now, every combat-trained nerve in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong in Millbrook Heights. The neighborhood felt different from the peaceful suburb he remembered from his last leave 3 years ago. The streets were unnaturally quiet for 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday. No children walked home from school. No parents waited at bus stops. Even the usual dog walkers were conspicuously absent. The only sound was the distant rumble of motorcycles, growing closer by the second. Sarah's familiar red brick Colonial looked the same as always, but the tension in the air was palpable. His sister had called him 2 weeks ago, her voice trembling, despite her attempts to sound casual, asking if he might visit now that his medical retirement was finalized. Thomas had heard the fear beneath her words, and now he understood why. The sound of the front door opening interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood there, her normally vibrant face drawn with worry. She'd lost weight since he'd last seen her, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Tommy," she whispered, glancing nervously up and down the street. "I'm so glad you're here, but you shouldn't be standing out in the open like this." Thomas grabbed his duffel bag and followed her inside, noting the new deadbolts on the door, the reinforced window frames, the security cameras carefully hidden in the porch lights. His sister, a high school principal, had turned her home into a fortress. The question was why. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and Sarah's signature chocolate chip cookies, but something felt off about the forced normalcy. Thomas methodically checked each room, an old habit from countless clearing operations. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, except for the baseball bat propped in every corner and the pepper spray canisters hidden in decorative bowls. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder. Thomas moved to the window, watching as 12 riders roared past, their black leather jackets emblazoned with a distinctive emblem, a hooded skeleton wielding a scythe. The lead rider turned his head, catching Thomas's eye through the window. Even at a distance, the man's sneer was visible beneath his skull-themed bandana. "The Reapers," Sarah said quietly, her hands clutching a coffee mug so tightly her knuckles whitened. "They moved into town 6 months ago, bought the old mill building on River Street. At first, it was just noise complaints and minor vandalism. But then..." A knock at the back door made her jump, sloshing coffee onto the hardwood floor. Mrs. Rivera, the elderly Spanish teacher from Oak Ridge High, stood on the back porch, nervously clutching her purse. Thomas recognized her from the graduation photo on Sarah's wall. "Principal Hawkins, thank God your brother is finally here," Mrs. Rivera whispered as Sarah ushered her inside. "The situation at school. It's becoming impossible. 3 more students dropped out this week. The parents are too scared to complain, but we all know why." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Mrs. Rivera painted a picture of systematic intimidation. The Reapers, led by a man known only as Death, had transformed the quiet town into their personal hunting ground. They recruited teenagers as drug runners, threatened teachers who reported suspicious activity, and turned the school grounds into their marketplace. The local police seemed helpless or unwilling to intervene. "Your sister," Mrs. Rivera continued, her voice cracking, "she's been trying to protect the students. She banned motorcycles from school property, installed security cameras, started random locker checks. That's when they began targeting her personally. The threatening phone calls, the vandalism, the dead animals left on her porch. Thomas's prosthetic leg creaked as his stance shifted, combat instincts surging. He'd spent 2 decades fighting terrorists overseas while his sister waged her own war at home. The familiar weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried, leading Marines through the world's deadliest combat zones. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A police siren wailed in the distance, then quickly died away. Mrs. Rivera flinched at the sound. "They own some of the officers," she explained. "The ones they can't bribe, they blackmail. The FBI sent an agent to investigate last month. 3 days later, his teenage daughter's car was run off the road. The message was clear. That changes today," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied his men through countless firefights. "Tell me about their operations, everything you know." As Mrs. Rivera detailed the Reaper's activities, Thomas's military training kicked in. He mentally mapped patrol routes, noted vulnerabilities, identified potential assets and threats. This wasn't so different from analyzing insurgent activities in hostile territory. The gang had turned his sister's school into a war zone. Now they were about to learn the cost of threatening a Marine's family. "Death," Sarah interrupted, speaking the gang leader's name like a curse. "He's ex-military himself. Dishonorable discharge from the Army 10 years ago for selling weapons to cartels. Now he runs the gang like a militant operation. They have schedules, rotations, even radio protocols." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they watched as 3 bikers surrounded a teenage boy who was walking home from track practice. Even from a distance, their threatening postures were clear. "Double the usual payment," one biker demanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Boss says your little sister's been late with her protection money too often." The boy, Thomas recognized him as Jason Chen, one of Sarah's star students, seemed to shrink into himself. "Please, my mom's in the hospital, the medical bills." The largest biker grabbed Jason's track team jacket. "Maybe we need to help you understand how business works around here, kid." Thomas was moving before conscious thought, muscle memory, and combat instincts taking over. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Tommy, no. They'll hurt you like they hurt the others who tried to help." He gently removed her hand. "Sarah, they don't know what hurt is, but they're about to learn the difference between terrorizing children and facing someone who fights back." As Thomas stepped off his sister's porch, 22 years of Marine Corps training guided his movements. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step purposeful. The American flag pin on his jacket caught the afternoon light, and in that moment, Thomas Hawkins made a silent promise. This was his family's home, and he was about to teach the Reapers that they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd brought their street tactics to a Marine's hometown. The fluorescent streetlights cast harsh shadows across the sidewalk as Thomas approached the 3 bikers. The largest one, wearing a vest that identified him as Scythe, still had his hand gripped on Jason's jacket, but his attention shifted to Thomas's measured footsteps on the concrete. "Evening, gentlemen," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from facing real combat. I believe young Mr. Chen explained his situation clearly. The 3 bikers exchanged glances before Scythe released Jason with a forceful shove. "Well, look who we got here, the new guy. Mind your own business, soldier boy. This doesn't concern you. You made it my concern when you put hands on one of my sister's students." Thomas positioned himself between Jason and the bikers, his prosthetic leg shifting silently beneath his jeans. "I understand you're collecting payments. Let's discuss a more reasonable arrangement." Scythe laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes as he studied Thomas's stance. 2 decades of combat had left their mark, not in obvious scars or medals, but in the way Thomas carried himself, the calm readiness that came from facing death in a dozen countries. "Listen up, tough guy. Scythe spat, trying to mask his unease with bravado. You don't make arrangements. Death makes arrangements. And right now, he's arranged for the Chen family to pay double, with interest. Behind Thomas, Jason whispered, Please, Master Sergeant Hawkins, don't cause trouble. They'll hurt my little sister like they hurt Mr. Peterson's son when he couldn't pay. No, they won't, Thomas replied without taking his eyes off Scythe. 'Cause these gentlemen is an attencarer. About to learn something important about this neighborhood. It's protected now. The shortest biker, a wiry man with a snake tattooed across his throat, pulled out a switchblade. The click of the blade opening echoed in the quiet street. Protected by who? You and that gimpy leg of yours? By all of us, Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You see, I've spent the last 22 years learning about protection. Real protection. Not extortion dressed up as security. And I've gotten very, very good at dealing with people who confuse the two. Scythe took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. Last chance to walk away, Sergeant. Wouldn't want to explain to death why we had to mess up a decorated veteran. I'm not a sergeant anymore, Thomas said quietly, which means I'm not bound by military rules of engagement. Think carefully about your next move. The third biker, silent until now, grabbed Scythe's arm. Hold up, this guy, I heard about him. Force Recon, 3 Purple Hearts. My cousin served with him in Fallujah. They called him Hawk because nothing escaped his sight, and his strikes were always lethal. Scythe shrugged off the warning. I don't care if he's Captain America, nobody disrespects the Reapers. He swung a meaty fist at Thomas's face. What happened next became neighborhood legend. Thomas moved with liquid precision, his prosthetic leg forgotten as muscle memory took over. He deflected the punch and used Scythe's momentum to send him sprawling. The snake-tattooed biker lunged with his knife, but Thomas caught his wrist, twisted, and the blade clattered to the ground along with its owner. The third biker backed away, hands raised. Hey, man, we're just doing our job. Your job? Thomas's voice carried across the street. Your job is terrorizing schoolchildren, extorting families, threatening teachers? He turned to Scythe, who was struggling to his feet. Tell Death I want to meet him, tomorrow night, the high school parking lot. Scythe spat blood onto the sidewalk. You're dead, Marine. You hear me? Dead. I've heard that before, Thomas replied calmly. From better men than you. Tomorrow night. Don't keep me waiting. As the bikers retreated to their motorcycles, a small crowd gathered at the edges of the street. Thomas could see fear in their eyes, but something else too, a spark of hope. Jason Chen clutched Thomas's arm. Master Sergeant Hawkins, you don't understand. Death, he's not just a gang leader, he has connections. Police, city hall, even judges. They'll hurt you. Thomas placed a steady hand on Jason's shoulder. When you were 12, my sister told me how you stayed after school every day to help the janitor, because his arthritis was getting worse. You showed kindness when it wasn't expected. Now it's my turn to return that kindness. The crowd grew larger. Thomas recognized faces from Sarah's stories. Coach Martinez, who'd stood up to the gang and had his car torched. Mrs. Chen, who'd tried to organize parents before her restaurant was vandalized. The Thompson twins who'd refused to sell drugs and paid for it with broken bones. Listen to me. Thomas raised his voice to address the gathering. I know you're scared. The Reapers have ruled through fear for too long. But fear only works when we're alone. Together, we're stronger than any gang. A police car cruised past slowly, its occupants watching but not stopping. Thomas noted the vehicle number. Tomorrow would be about more than just confronting death. It would be about exposing everyone who enabled the Reaper's reign of terror. Back inside, Thomas found Sarah and Mrs. Rivera waiting anxiously. I saw what happened, Sarah whispered. Tommy, what you did. But Death, he doesn't fight fair. Neither do I, Thomas replied. Not anymore. He walked to his duffel bag and opened a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small case containing everything he'd need. Not weapons, but something far more dangerous to men like death: evidence. For the next several hours, Thomas made calls to old contacts: a Marine Corps intelligence officer who owed him from their days in Afghanistan, an ATF agent he'd worked with on weapons trafficking, a U.S. attorney who'd never forgotten how Thomas had saved her brother in Kandahar. By midnight, Sarah's dining room table was covered in papers, photos, and maps. The Reapers had been careful, but they'd never faced someone trained in military intelligence. Every protection payment, every act of violence, every corrupt cop, it all formed a pattern, and patterns could be broken. A text message lit up Thomas's phone. "You're a dead man, Marine. Death sends his regards." Thomas smiled grimly. They still didn't understand. They thought this was about territory, about power, about fear, but they were wrong. This was about justice, and tomorrow night, the Reapers would learn what happened when they brought their street tactics against a man who'd spent his life training for real war. Outside, motorcycles roared past his sister's house, then another, and another. They were watching, trying to intimidate him. But Thomas Hawkins had stared down warlords and terrorists. The Reapers were about to discover they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd threatened the wrong veteran's family. Dawn broke over Millbrook Heights with an uneasy silence. Thomas had spent the night reviewing satellite images of the neighborhood, another skill from his military days that was about to prove useful. The Reapers' patrol patterns were sloppy, predictable. They never expected anyone to study them this closely. A soft knock at the door revealed Officer Maria Rodriguez looking nervous in her crisp uniform. "Master Sergeant Hawkins, I worked with your sister on the school safety committee before the Reapers shut it down." Thomas gestured for her to enter. "The department?" Rodriguez glanced over her shoulder. "There's not much we can do officially. They have videos of officers taking bribes, photos of us with prostitutes, some real, some doctored. Evidence disappears. Witnesses change their stories." "Which officers?" Thomas's voice was quiet, but intense. "Lieutenant Hayes, Sergeant Cooper, maybe others." Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping records, but my captain says to drop it." Thomas studied the young officer. "Why are you telling me this? Your sister, when they started threatening students, she was the only one who stood up, said someone had to protect the kids." Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. 2 days later, they broke into the school, trashed her office, left a dead cat on her desk. Thomas's jaw tightened. "They broke in?" "That wasn't in the police report." "There was no report. Hayes lost the paperwork." Rodriguez straightened her shoulders. "I became a cop to protect people, not to watch thugs terrorize children." "Tonight," Thomas said, "things change. But I need you to do something for me." By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispered conversations. The confrontation with Scythe had sparked something. Not quite hope, but a restless energy. The Reapers responded by flooding the streets with members, their presence more aggressive than usual. Thomas watched from Sarah's porch as 3 bikers harassed Mrs. Chen, demanding immediate payment for extra protection. The elderly woman's hands shook as she counted out bills from her retirement check. His phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. "Last chance, Marine. Leave town, or we burn everything you care about, starting with your sister's precious school." Thomas's response was simple: "Come try." Inside, he continued gathering intelligence. Rodriguez's notebook provided names, dates, locations. The Reapers had started small. Noise complaints, vandalism, then protection payments from local businesses. Soon, they controlled everything from school security contracts to cafeteria supplies. Death's military background had helped him create a network of corruption, reaching into every aspect of town governance. A knock at the back door revealed Jason Chen. "Principal Hawkins sent me," the boy whispered, handing over a USB drive. "Security camera footage. Mom's been saving it. Every payment, every threat. She was too scared to show the police. Your mother's a brave woman. They broke her arm last month, said it was a warning. Jason's eyes hardened. Make them pay, Master Sergeant. By afternoon, more people came forward. Mrs. Rivera brought her late husband's police scanner, perfect for monitoring Reaper communications. Coach Martinez offered his hunting cabin as a safe house. Even Mr. Chen, whose restaurant had been vandalized, provided documentation of suspicious insurance claim denials. Thomas's command center expanded. Maps marked with patrol routes, lists of corrupted officials, financial records showing money movements. The Reapers had created their own little kingdom, but they'd never faced an enemy who understood asymmetrical warfare. A commotion outside drew his attention. 2 bikers were spray-painting threats on Sarah's garage door. Dead Marine walking. Thomas watched calmly through his security cameras, newly installed last night, recording everything. The bikers took special pleasure in destroying Sarah's prized rose garden, a memorial to her late husband. Officer Rodriguez called with an update. They're nervous. Death called an emergency meeting. Every member has been ordered to the school tonight. Perfect. Everything ready on your end? State Police Tactical Unit is on standby at TF2. Thomas checked his watch. Time to prepare for tonight. He spent the next hour calling his volunteers, veterans from 4 wars who lived in the area, men and women who understood duty, who remembered what it meant to protect their community. Mr. Thompson, a Vietnam vet, positioned himself in the school's bell tower, perfect overview of the parking lot. The Martinez twins, both ex-Army Rangers, took up positions covering the back exits. Every approach, every escape route would be watched. As sunset approached, Thomas made one final call to his ATF contact. You have everything? Enough to take down their whole operation. Just get us proof of Death's direct involvement. Thomas hung up and walked to his sister's bedroom. Inside the closet, hidden behind photo albums, was a small recording device, military grade, courtesy of his Force Recon days. Mrs. Rivera appeared at his door one last time. Thomas, please be careful. These men, they're animals. No, Mrs. Rivera. Animals kill for food or survival. These men do it for pleasure. He checked his watch. That's why they need to be stopped. Outside, motorcycles roared in the distance, dozens of them. The Reapers were gathering for what they thought would be their victory. They didn't understand that Thomas had spent 22 years learning the art of war. Tonight wouldn't be a street fight, it would be an operation, and the Reapers were about to learn the difference between being predators and being prey. As darkness fell, Thomas stepped off his sister's porch, his prosthetic leg moving silently beneath his jeans. The high school loomed against the darkening sky, its windows casting fluorescent light across the empty parking lot. Once a place of learning and growth, now it served as the Reapers' fortress. Motorcycles lined the parking lot. Thomas counted 43 plus 6 pickup trucks belonging to their associates in local government. His earpiece crackled softly. Bell tower in position, Mr. Thompson whispered. Got eyes on 4 armed guards on the roof. Martinez twins checking in. Back lot covered. They've got 3 men at the service entrance. Abier Mandalesier Natain. Vizier Estapifir Rodriguez's voice came next. State police units in position, 5 minutes out, a TF tactical team standing by. Thomas walked alone down the middle of the parking lot, no weapons visible. They'd be expecting that. Instead, he carried a small digital recorder in his jacket pocket, knowing what it would capture would hurt Death far more than any bullet. 2 massive bikers blocked the gymnasium entrance, arms crossed. Hold up, tough guy. Need to check you for weapons. Check all you want, Thomas said calmly. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to negotiate. They patted him down roughly, then escorted him inside. The gymnasium where his sister had hosted hundreds of school assemblies had been transformed. A makeshift throne sat on the basketball court, surrounded by Reaper members. Death lounged there, every inch the fallen soldier in his tactical vest and combat boots. Welcome, Master Sergeant Hawkins, Death's voice carried across the court. The legendary Hawk. I've heard so much about you. Tell me, how's that prosthetic working out? I heard Fallujah was explosive. Thomas studied his opponent. Marcus Death Ramirez, age 38, former Army Special Forces, dishonorably discharged for selling weapons to drug cartels. Built his gang through a combination of military tactics and calculated brutality. You've caused quite a stir, Death continued, interfering with legitimate business transactions, threatening my men. Very disappointing. Legitimate? Thomas's voice remained calm. Like breaking into my sister's school, terrorizing children, forcing teenagers to sell drugs? Death smiled. Tragic necessities. No police reports filed, as I recall. Just like there won't be a report when they find what's left of you tomorrow. Laughter rippled through the gang members. Thomas noted positions, weapons, exits, old habits that never died. Before we discuss my future, Thomas pulled out his phone. Let's talk about yours. I have some interesting documents. Financial records, witness statements, footage of Lieutenant Hayes accepting bribes. ATF surveillance of your weapons deals. Death's smile faltered slightly. Documents can be lost. Witnesses change their minds. You're not the first to try this. True. But I'm the first who sent copies to every law enforcement agency in 4 states, plus major media outlets. Time-release emails set to send everything at midnight unless I stop them. The smile vanished completely. You're bluffing. Thomas pulled out a thick folder. Your protection racket brings in roughly $200,000 a month, split between 50 core members, minus 60% kicked up to your friends in City Hall. That's why you needed to double the Chen family's payments to cover Sergeant Cooper's gambling debts. Murmurs spread through the gathered bikers. Thomas caught uncertainty in some faces, fear in others. They'd never faced an opponent who'd done his homework. Scythe, Death barked, show our guest what happens to people who spread lies. The large biker from yesterday's confrontation stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. But Thomas wasn't finished. Interesting timing, he continued. Scythe here tried to shake down Jason Chen exactly when Lieutenant Hayes scheduled a truancy check, almost like it was coordinated. More murmurs. Death's face contorted with rage. Enough! Kill him! Scythe charged, but Thomas was ready. 20 years of close combat training took over. He sidestepped the wild punch, using Scythe's momentum to send him crashing into the bleachers. Now! Thomas shouted into his concealed mic. Windows shattered as flashbang grenades exploded. State police tactical teams rappelled from the roof. TF agents burst through side doors. The Martinez twins crashed through the back entrance with local SWAT. Chaos erupted. Some bikers tried to fight, others ran. Death scrambled for a hidden exit but found Mr. Thompson blocking his path, hunting rifle raised. Going somewhere, soldier? In less than 3 minutes, it was over. Thomas stood in the center of the court, surrounded by groaning bikers and the sounds of handcuffs clicking shut. Death, face bloodied from resisting arrest, glared at Thomas. You think this changes anything? I have friends. Powerful friends. You had friends, Thomas corrected him. But they're all going down with you. Right now, FBI agents are raiding homes of every official in your pocket. That includes Judge Harrison, who signed so many favorable rulings for you. Officer Rodriguez approached, holding papers. Master Sergeant Hawkins. Arrest warrants just came through for Hayes and Cooper. We're picking them up now. Thomas nodded, then turned back to Death. See, you made a classic mistake. You thought fear and violence were the ultimate weapons, but information, that's what really wins wars. As the Reapers were led away in handcuffs, Thomas retrieved his recorder. Inside, every word, every threat, every admission of corruption had been captured. Through his earpiece, he heard Mr. Thompson whisper, "Your sister would be proud, son." Outside, neighbors had gathered, watching as their tormentors were loaded into police vans. The long nightmare was ending, but Thomas knew his work wasn't finished. Corrupted systems needed cleaning, damaged lives needed rebuilding, a community needed to heal. But tonight, as he watched death being led away, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He'd fought wars in distant lands, but this victory here in his sister's school, felt more significant than any medal he'd earned. The Reapers had ruled through fear. They never understood that real strength comes from protecting others. Now, they had all the time in the world to learn that lesson from inside a prison cell. Dawn broke over Millbrook Heights differently the next morning. Children waited at bus stops without fear. Mrs. Chen opened her restaurant on time without waiting for collectors. And Sarah's high school buzzed with a new energy as students arrived for classes. But Thomas knew better than to celebrate too early. 22 years of military service had taught him that the aftermath of victory often proved more challenging than the battle itself. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since midnight. ATF agents needed statements, state police requested documentation, local news wanted interviews. The most urgent call, however, came from Jason Chen. "Master Sergeant Hawkins," the boy's voice trembled. "They're back. Not the Reapers, but their allies, the Iron Demons from South Boston. They're at Mom's restaurant." Thomas was moving before Jason finished speaking. He'd anticipated this. Power vacuums always attracted opportunists. Through his earpiece, he alerted his volunteer network. "Thompson, you copy?" "Read you clear, son. Already got eyes on them. 6 bikes, 3 cars. They're trying to take over the Reapers' territory." Thomas reached the restaurant in time to see 8 men in Iron Demon's colors surrounding Mrs. Chen. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man called Chains Wakatamaida, was making their position clear. "Reapers are gone," Chains grinned. "But business continues. Same arrangement, new management." "The arrangement is over." Thomas's voice cut through the morning air. "This neighborhood isn't accepting new management applications." Chains turned, studying Thomas with cold eyes. "The famous Master Sergeant Hawkins. You caused quite a mess last night. But you don't understand how things work. There's always someone ready to step in." "Actually," Thomas moved closer, noting positions and weapons with practiced ease. "You don't understand. The Reapers didn't just lose their leaders. We exposed their entire network. Every corrupt cop, every bought official. Right now, the FBI is freezing accounts, seizing assets, arresting collaborators." Chain's grin faltered slightly. "You think that matters? Streets don't care about FBI investigations." "True," Thomas agreed. "But they care about profit. Look around. Every store has cameras now, connected to a secure network. Every transaction is recorded, every threat documented. The old system is gone." Through his earpiece, Thomas heard the Martinez twins confirming positions. Mr. Thompson had his scope trained on Chains from the school's roof. Officer Rodriguez had state police units on standby. "You're outnumbered." Chains stepped forward, finger tapping the gun visible beneath his jacket. "I notice everything," Thomas replied calmly. "Like how your right hand keeps twitching toward your weapon. You're favoring an old shoulder injury. Your men keep looking over their shoulders because they know my people have them surrounded. And your car's engines are still running, meaning you're not as confident as you pretend." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Chains's face. He hadn't expected this level of tactical analysis from a neighborhood watchdog. "Last chance," Thomas continued. "Leave now. Tell your friends this territory is protected. Not by gangs, not by corrupt cops, but by the people who live here. People who aren't afraid anymore." Chains tried to maintain his tough facade, but Thomas saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. The Reapers' fall had changed the equation. Territory wasn't worth much if it came with federal attention. "This isn't over," Chains spat, backing toward his bike. "Actually, it is." Thomas pulled out his phone. "Because while we've been talking, facial recognition software has been running on my security feeds. Interesting warrant you have in Rhode Island. Would be a shame if that information reached local authorities." The Iron Demons retreated, trying to look tough but fooling no one. As their bikes roared away, neighbors emerged from their shops and homes. Mrs. Chen gripped Thomas's arm. "They will tell others," the old woman worried. "Other gangs will come." "Let them come," Thomas smiled. "Each time they'll find us stronger, better organized, more united. That's how you win a war. Not just by fighting battles, but by making the enemy realize the cost is too high." Throughout the day, Thomas coordinated with Officer Rodriguez and his volunteer network. Security cameras were installed at strategic points. Communication protocols were established. The neighborhood watch was rebuilt, this time with military precision. Mrs. Rivera brought coffee to the volunteers. "Thomas, what you did, taking down the Reapers, scaring off the Iron Demons. It's amazing. But can we really keep this up?" Thomas watched as students played freely in the schoolyard for the first time in months. "We don't have a choice. Freedom isn't a one-time achievement. It requires constant vigilance." His phone buzzed, the ATF agent from last night. "Hawkins, you need to see this. We're finding connections between the Reapers and bigger operations, gun runners, human trafficking, drug cartels. Your sister's town was just the tip of the iceberg." Thomas thought about the scared faces he'd seen yesterday, the relieved ones today. "Send me everything you have. If they want a war, we'll give them one." As evening approached, Thomas sat on his sister's porch, watching his neighbors reclaim their streets. The Reapers were gone, but he knew this was just the beginning. Other threats would come, but this time they wouldn't find scared victims. They'd find a community united, organized, and led by someone who understood that real peace comes through strength, vigilance, and the unwavering commitment to protect what matters. The war for Millbrook Heights was just beginning, and Thomas Hawkins intended to win it, not just for his sister's sake, but for every person who'd ever felt powerless against those who ruled through fear. 3 days after the Reapers' fall, Thomas sat in Sarah's study, reviewing intelligence reports. The FBI's investigation had uncovered disturbing connections. Death's operation wasn't just about neighborhood extortion. It was a hub for larger criminal enterprises. Officer Rodriguez arrived with fresh coffee and worrying news. "They're releasing some of the lower-ranking Reapers on bail. Legal technicalities. Death's old connections are still working the system." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "They'll try to reorganize, rebuild their power base. That's why we're not waiting." He spread a map across the desk, marking locations with red pins. Every safe house, every stash spot, every meeting place the Reapers used. "We're not just defending anymore. We're taking the fight to them." "That's not exactly legal," Rodriguez worried. "Everything I do is legal," Thomas corrected her. "We're just going to make it impossible for them to operate. Watch and learn." His phone buzzed, Mr. Thompson reporting from his observation post. 3 former Reapers at the Blue Moon Bar looking mighty unhappy. "Good." Thomas checked his watch. Right on schedule. He'd spent his military career studying enemy patterns, predicting responses. The Reapers' remnants were painfully predictable. First, they'd gather at their old haunts, then they'd try to reassert control through violence. But Thomas had already changed the battlefield. "Martinez twins, you copy? Operation Clean Sweep is a go." Across town, carefully orchestrated moves began. Health inspectors, honest ones this time, descended on Reaper-connected businesses. Building inspectors found violations at their apartments. Traffic cops monitored their movements. "This is harassment," one biker complained to Officer Rodriguez. "No," she replied, writing another ticket. "This is law enforcement. Get used to it." By nightfall, the message was clear. Millbrook Heights wouldn't be easy pickings anymore. But Thomas knew the real challenges were still coming. His ATF contact called with urgent news. "Hawkins, we've got movement. Cartel soldiers arriving from down south. They're not happy about losing their distribution network." "How many?" "At least 30, heavily armed. These aren't street thugs. They're trained killers." Thomas smiled grimly. "So am I." He activated his volunteer network. Veterans from 4 wars, each watching different sectors of the neighborhood. Mrs. Rivera's ham radio crackled with encoded updates. "Contact," Mr. Thompson radioed. 4 SUVs, tinted windows, moving south on Maple. "Martinez twins, you have eyes on the back routes?" Affirmative, they're trying to set up a perimeter. Thomas had expected this. The cartel wouldn't just send soldiers, they'd send professionals. But they didn't know they were walking into a prepared battlefield. Execute Operation Spotlight, he ordered. Suddenly, powerful floodlights blazed from rooftops and windows, illuminating every shadow where the cartel soldiers might hide. Security cameras pivoted, covering every angle. Motion sensors activated. What the hell? One cartel soldier cursed as his tactical advantage vanished. Thomas's voice carried through carefully placed speakers. Gentlemen, welcome to Millbrook Heights. I see you brought weapons, which is a violation of local ordinances. I should mention you're currently surrounded by multiple law enforcement agencies. It wasn't a bluff. FBI tactical teams had been waiting. State police SWAT units emerged from concealed positions. Even honest local cops tired of corruption joined the operation. You have exactly 1 minute to surrender, Thomas continued. After that, things get complicated. The cartel soldiers were good, but they weren't prepared for this level of coordination. They'd expected to intimidate a neighborhood. Instead, they found themselves in a military-style ambush. "This isn't over," their leader shouted as they retreated. "The cartel doesn't forget." "Neither do I," Thomas muttered, watching through his surveillance feeds. Later that night, his volunteers gathered in Sarah's living room. The Martinez twins brought pizza. Officer Rodriguez provided updates on arrests. Mr. Thompson cleaned his rifle while providing tactical assessments. "They'll be back," Thompson warned. "Cartels hate losing territory." "Let them come," Thomas replied. "Each time they'll find us stronger. This isn't just about defending anymore, it's about sending a message. Millbrook Heights isn't just another target. It's a community that fights back." Mrs. Rivera brought coffee, her hands no longer shaking. "Thomas, what you've done, it's a miracle. But can we really stand against a cartel?" Thomas showed them the map, now marked with defensive positions, escape routes, safe houses. "We're not just standing against them. We're building something they can't defeat. A community that's not afraid." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The cartel says hello. Your sister's roses are pretty. Would be a shame if something happened to them." Thomas's jaw tightened. They still didn't understand. Threats wouldn't work anymore. Millbrook Heights had changed. Its people had changed. "Rodriguez," he called. "Contact your FBI friends. Tell them it's time for Phase 2. "The complete takedown?" she asked. "Everything. Every cartel connection, every corrupt official, every dirty cop still on their payroll. No more playing defense." As his volunteers dispersed to their posts, Thomas stood on the porch, watching his neighborhood. Lights glowed in windows that had been dark for months. Children's laughter echoed from yards that had been silent. The reapers were gone, but the war for Millbrook Heights' soul was far from over. The cartel would send more soldiers. Other gangs would test their defenses. Corruption would try to creep back in, but they would learn what the reapers learned, that they hadn't just threatened a neighborhood. They'd awakened a warrior who knew that some battles were worth any cost. And Thomas Hawkins was just getting started. Sunrise painted Millbrook Heights in shades of amber as Thomas reviewed the night's intelligence reports. The cartel's failed intimidation attempt had changed the game, escalating what began as a neighborhood dispute into something far more dangerous. His secure phone lit up with a message from his ATF contact. "Intercepted communications, cartel leadership meeting in Mexico. Your neighborhood is now their top priority." Thomas studied satellite images of the area, marking potential vulnerabilities. His military training indicated that this calm was temporary, merely the prelude to a storm. Mrs. Rivera knocked on the door, her face pale. "Thomas, someone left this on my porch." She handed him a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots of neighborhood children walking to school, elderly residents at the market, families in their homes. The message was clear. The cartel had eyes everywhere. "They're trying to terrorize us again," Mrs. Rivera whispered, "like the Reapers did." "No," Thomas replied, examining the photos with professional interest. "They're showing their hand. These shots all come from the same angles, same time patterns. They want us to know they're watching, but they just revealed their surveillance positions." His radio crackled. "Major," Mr. Thompson's voice was urgent. "Movement at the old industrial park. Multiple vehicles, heavily armed men. They're establishing a forward operating base." Thomas noted this, classic cartel tactic. First intimidation, then show of force, finally territorial occupation. Officer Rodriguez arrived with more troubling news. 3 former Reaper members found dead. Message carved into their chests. "This is cartel territory now." Thomas's jaw tightened. The cartel was escalating faster than expected, trying to fill the power vacuum before the community could strengthen its defenses. "Rodriguez, contact your FBI liaison. We need those warrant requests expedited. Thompson, maintain surveillance but do not engage. Martinez twins, start evacuating our high-risk residents to the safe houses." His volunteers moved with practiced efficiency. Weeks of training and coordination had transformed them from concerned citizens into an effective defense force. "What about the schools?" Mrs. Rivera asked. "Those photos they took." "Mi querida dame." "Already handled." Thomas showed her his tablet, displaying a new security system. "Every school now has retired veterans as security guards, high-resolution cameras, panic buttons. No child in Millbrook Heights will ever be vulnerable again." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You play soldier in your little neighborhood, but you don't understand what's coming. The cartel doesn't negotiate. We take what we want." Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. "Actually," he murmured, "you don't understand what you're facing." Throughout the day, he monitored cartel movements through his surveillance network. They were professional, he had to admit. Their operations showed military precision. But they'd made one critical mistake. They thought they were fighting a neighborhood watch. They didn't realize they were facing a carefully coordinated resistance, led by someone who'd spent decades studying asymmetrical warfare. "Major," the Martinez twins radioed in. "Cartel soldiers questioning people at the market, looking for weak points, gathering intel." "Let them look," Thomas replied. "Every person they threaten, every business they target just strengthens our case." His ATF contact called again. "Hawkins, it's worse than we thought. The cartel's not just sending soldiers. They're sending El Chirujano, their top enforcer. Former special forces suspected in over 40 murders." "Good," Thomas said quietly. "Let's give him something to enforce." As evening approached, Thomas gathered his core team in Sarah's living room. The room had become their command center, walls covered with maps and surveillance photos. "They'll hit us hard," he explained, "but we've got something they don't expect. A community that won't break. Every threat makes us stronger. Every act of intimidation brings us closer together." Officer Rodriguez studied the tactical displays. "The department's compromised again. New cartel money buying old corruptions. Then we'll clean house again," Thomas assured her. "This was never going to be a quick victory. We're not just fighting criminals. We're fighting a system that allows them to thrive." His secure radio crackled. "Thompson reporting from observation post. Major, unmarked vans entering the industrial park. Heavy weapons being unloaded. They're preparing for war." Thomas checked his watch. Everything was proceeding according to his analysis. The cartel was predictable. They only knew one way to solve problems. "Let them come," he told his volunteers. "Every move they make, every threat they issue, every weapon they bring, it all goes into our evidence files. While they're preparing for a war, We're building a case that will destroy their entire operation." Mrs. Rivera touched his arm. "Thomas, what if they target you directly? These people, they're not like the Reapers." "No," he agreed. "They're worse, which means we have to be better, smarter, more determined." Outside, the sun set over Millbrook Heights. Lights came on in homes that once stayed dark in fear. Children played in yards that had been empty for months. The neighborhood was healing, finding its strength. But Thomas knew the real fight was just beginning. The cartel wouldn't stop with threats and intimidation. They were coming to erase Millbrook Heights' resistance, to make an example of anyone who dared stand against them. They didn't understand that some things were worth any cost, that real strength came not from violence or fear, but from protecting others. Let them come, Thomas thought, watching his tactical displays. They're about to learn what the Reapers learned, that they haven't just threatened a neighborhood, they've declared war on a community that refuses to surrender. And surrender wasn't in Thomas Hawkins's vocabulary. The first sign of the cartel's real offensive came at midnight, not with violence, but with money. Thomas watched through his surveillance network as luxury SUVs delivered men in expensive suits to City Hall for an emergency council meeting. "They're buying the whole system," Officer Rodriguez reported, monitoring police channels. "New bribes, bigger promises, half the council's already in their pocket." Thomas had expected this, that the cartel operated differently from street gangs. They corrupted from the top down. By morning, parking enforcement was ticketing cars outside resistant businesses. Health inspectors suddenly found violations at stores that supported the neighborhood watch. Building permits were mysteriously revoked. "They're trying to strangle us legally," Mr. Thompson said during the emergency community meeting. His grocery store had just lost its liquor license without explanation. "Not legally," Thomas corrected. "They're using the law as a weapon, but they don't understand what they're up against." He unveiled his counter-move. Dozens of file boxes containing financial records, surveillance footage, documented bribe payments. 20 years of military intelligence work had taught him to gather evidence of everything. "Every council member who voted against us," he explained. "Their offshore accounts are now being investigated. Every inspector who suddenly found violations, their connection to cartel shell companies is documented. They think they're buying a system, but they're really building their own prison." His phone buzzed with a message from his ATF contact. "El Cirujano arrived last night, already 4 bodies found. He's sending a message." Thomas studied the crime scene photos. The victims were former Reaper members who'd refused to work with the cartel. Their deaths were meant to show the price of resistance. "They still think this is about fear," he told his volunteers. "Time to show them what real strength looks like." Throughout the day, Millbrook Heights resistance intensified. When cartel soldiers tried intimidating shop owners, they found veterans waiting. When corrupt cops performed random searches, residents filmed everything. Every move the cartel made was documented, every threat recorded. "Major," the Martinez twins radioed from their observation post, "El Cirujano's making moves. Spotted him meeting with former Reapers at the abandoned factory." "Good," Thomas replied. "Rodriguez, notify your FBI contact. Time for Phase 3. Phase 3 was what Thomas did best, turning the enemy's strength against them. The cartel had sent their top enforcer to break Millbrook Heights' spirit. Instead, they'd given Thomas the perfect target. As night fell, El Cirujano made his move. Thomas's surveillance cameras caught him approaching Mrs. Rivera's house, likely choosing her as an easy target to terrorize the community. But Mrs. Rivera wasn't alone. Thomas's network had anticipated this, prepared for it. "Now!" Thomas commanded through his radio. Floodlights blazed. El Cirujano found himself surrounded by FBI tactical teams, their weapons trained on his position. His reputation for violence meant nothing against overwhelming force. "Miguel El Cirujano Herrera," Thomas's voice carried across the quiet street. "You're under arrest for 42 counts of first-degree murder. The cartel can't help you now." El Cirujano tried to fight. He was good, Thomas had to admit, but not good enough against operators who'd trained for exactly this scenario. As the FBI led him away, Thomas received another text from an unknown number. "You think one arrest changes anything? We own this city now." "Check your accounts," Thomas replied. "Check all of them." Within hours, the cartel's carefully constructed network began to crumble. Shell companies were exposed, bank accounts were frozen, every official they'd bribed suddenly faced federal investigation. "This is impossible," a cartel lieutenant was heard saying on intercepted communications. "How did they trace everything?" The answer was simple. Thomas hadn't just been fighting the cartel. He'd been documenting their entire operation, building a case that would destroy their infrastructure. Back at his command center, Thomas briefed his volunteers. The cartel made the same mistake as the Reapers. They thought fear was their greatest weapon. They never understood that documentation, evidence, and community solidarity are more powerful than violence. Officer Rodriguez brought fresh intelligence. They're pulling back, regrouping. But Thomas, there's chatter about bringing in heavy hitters from Mexico, real killers. "Let them come," Thomas said quietly. "Every enforcer they send, every dollar they spend, every threat they make just strengthens our position. They don't understand we're not just defending a neighborhood anymore, we're dismantling their entire operation." Mrs. Rivera served coffee to the volunteers. Her hands no longer shook when sirens passed. "Thomas, what you've done, it's more than just protecting us. You've given us back our dignity." Thomas studied the tactical displays showing cartel movements. They were adapting, changing strategies. But so was Millbrook Heights. Each confrontation made the community stronger, more united. "They'll try again," he warned his people. "The cartel doesn't accept defeat easily, but neither do we." Outside, Millbrook Heights settled into another night, but it wasn't the fearful darkness of recent months. Porch lights glowed, neighbors chatted across fences, children slept safely in their beds. The cartel would send more soldiers, more money, more threats. But they would learn what the Reapers learned, what El Cirujano learned, that they hadn't just targeted a neighborhood. They'd awakened a community that refused to be victimized. And they'd challenged a warrior who knew that some battles weren't just worth fighting. They were worth winning at any cost. The cartel's response came at dawn, not with violence, but with lawyers. Dozens of them, filing lawsuits against Thomas, his volunteers, the neighborhood watch, anyone who dared resist their control. "They're trying to drown us in legal fees," Officer Rodriguez explained, dropping another stack of court papers on Thomas's desk. "Harassment claims, civil rights violations, defamation suits." Thomas studied the documents with a grim smile. They still don't understand. Every lawsuit requires discovery. Every claim needs evidence. They're not attacking us. They're giving us legal access to their entire operation. His phone rang, his ATF contact sounding worried. "Hawkins, cartel leadership is furious. They've never failed to take territory before. They're calling in specialists, not just killers. Extortionists, blackmailers, experts in psychological warfare." "Perfect," Thomas replied. "Let them waste resources. Every specialist they send is another thread we can pull to unravel their organization." Throughout the morning, Thomas watched the cartel's new tactics unfold. Local media suddenly ran stories questioning the neighborhood watch's methods. Anonymous sources claimed Thomas was a dangerous vigilante. Social media filled with orchestrated outrage. "They're trying to turn public opinion against us," Mrs. Rivera worried, showing him the latest news reports. "No," Thomas corrected her. "They're showing their desperation. Each false story, each planted narrative gives us more evidence of their coordination." His secure radio crackled. Thompson reporting from observation post. Major, got eyes on some interesting visitors. Cartels meeting with former city officials, judges, even some state legislators. "Document everything," Thomas ordered. "They think they're building alliances. They're actually creating a conspiracy map for federal prosecutors. By midday, the pressure intensified. Building inspectors condemned 3 supportive businesses. The health department suspended restaurant licenses. Police conducted random traffic stops on neighborhood watch volunteers. But Millbrook Heights had changed. Instead of cowering, residents filmed every interaction. Instead of paying bribes, business owners documented every inspection. The cartel's bureaucratic warfare backfired, creating a paper trail of corruption. They're getting desperate, Officer Rodriguez noted, monitoring police channels. Chatter suggests they're planning something big, multiple teams moving into position. Thomas checked his tactical displays. The cartel had learned from their previous failures, deploying forces more carefully. But they still didn't understand what they were really fighting. Rodriguez, activate Protocol Echo. Thompson, alert all observation posts. Martinez twins, begin evacuation procedures. His volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, implementing plans they'd rehearsed dozens of times. Within hours, high-risk residents were relocated to safe houses. Surveillance coverage doubled. Every approach to Millbrook Heights was monitored. "You've turned the whole neighborhood into a fortress," Rodriguez marveled. "Not a fortress," Thomas corrected her. "A community. The cartel keeps thinking in terms of territory and control. They don't understand that we're not just defending streets. We're protecting homes, families, lives." His phone buzzed with another threat. "You've made powerful enemies. Everyone has a breaking point. We'll find yours." Thomas's response was simple. "Others have tried." As evening approached, the cartel's new offensive began, not with violence but with precision strikes at the community's weakest points. Anonymous calls to child services targeted supporting families. Tax auditors appeared at resistant businesses. Building code violations mysteriously multiplied. But Thomas had anticipated this. Each false report was documented. Each targeted audit created evidence of correlation. The cartel's attempts to use the system as a weapon became proof of their corruption. "Major," the Martinez twins radioed in. "They're moving in specialists, former intelligence operatives, psychological warfare experts." "Good," Thomas replied. "Let them come. Every specialist they deploy is another thread we can pull." In his command center, Thomas studied the pattern of cartel movements. They were learning, adapting, but so was Millbrook Heights. Each new tactic strengthened the community's resolve. "They think they're fighting a neighborhood," he explained to his volunteers. "They don't understand they're facing a movement. Every person they threaten, every business they target, just adds to our evidence pile." Mrs. Rivera brought coffee to the watchers. "Thomas, these people, they're not just criminals. They have real power, real connections." "Yes," he agreed. "And that's their weakness. The bigger their network, the more vulnerabilities they create. Every corrupt official, every bought judge, every compromised cop is another point of failure." Outside, Millbrook Heights prepared for another night of vigilance. But the atmosphere had changed. Where once there was fear, now there was determination. Where there was isolation, now there was unity. The cartel would send more specialists, more lawyers, more threats. But they would learn what the Reapers learned, that they hadn't just challenged a neighborhood. They'd awakened a community that understood true strength came not from violence or fear, but from standing together against those who would rule through intimidation. And Thomas Mitchell was just getting started. "Let them come," he murmured, watching his tactical displays. They're about to learn that some enemies can't be bought, some communities can't be broken, and some battles are worth any price. The war for Millbrook Heights' soul was entering a new phase. But this time the defenders weren't just fighting back. They were winning. The cartel's next move came through an unexpected channel. Thomas discovered it during his morning intelligence review. A complex web of real estate transactions sweeping through Millbrook Heights like a silent plague. The pattern emerged slowly at first. A storefront here, an apartment building there. But as he studied the documents spread across his desk, the true scope of their strategy became clear. They're buying properties through shell companies, Officer Rodriguez explained, laying out page after page of property records. Her fingers traced the connections between seemingly unrelated corporations. Look at this: Sunrise Development LLC, Vista Property Management, Horizon Investments, all created within the last month, all paying triple market value. Thomas leaned over the documents, his military training kicking in as he analyzed the pattern. The purchases weren't random. They formed a strategic web across Millbrook Heights. "They're not just buying buildings," he said, marking locations on his tactical map. "They're controlling choke points, access routes, surveillance positions. This is a military-grade encirclement strategy dressed up as real estate development." His secure phone lit up with an urgent message from his ATF contact. "Hawkins, it's worse than we thought. They've infiltrated the City Planning Commission. Martinez just intercepted communications about new zoning laws targeting your neighborhood. They're pushing them through tonight." The cartel had evolved from their previous tactics. Instead of brute force, they were wielding bureaucracy like a weapon. By controlling property and manipulating zoning laws, they could legally force out resistant residents without firing a single shot. "Clever," Thomas admitted, studying the overlay of property acquisitions and proposed zoning changes. "But predictable. Every paper trail leads somewhere." Throughout the morning, he watched their strategy unfold with military precision. Mrs. Peterson, who'd owned the corner bakery for 40 years, received an eviction notice citing structural concerns. The Thompson family's hardware store faced a sudden 1,000% rent increase. The community center's renovation permits were mysteriously denied. Mr. Chen, his restaurant still bearing scars from the Reapers era, shuffled into Thomas's command center. His hands trembled as he placed a thick envelope on the desk. "They came this morning, men in expensive suits talking about urban renewal. Offered 5 times what the restaurant is worth." His voice cracked. "Said if I don't sell, they'll condemn the building for health code violations." "Did you sign anything?" Thomas asked sharply, already reaching for his secure phone. "Number." Mr. Chen straightened his shoulders, a flash of the defiance that had helped him survive the Reapers showing through. "My father built this restaurant with his own hands. Some things aren't for sale." Thomas smiled, recognizing the same spirit that had carried him through countless battles. Good, because they just made their first major mistake. He activated his surveillance network, a system far more sophisticated than the cartel realized. Every property transaction, every permit denial, every zoning change created a documented pattern. While the cartel thought they were using the system, they were actually exposing their entire operation. "Major," Thompson's voice crackled over the secure radio from his observation post. "Got eyes on some interesting meetings at City Hall. Cartel lawyers with the Planning Commission, real estate agents, bank managers. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore." "Record everything," Thomas ordered, his mind already mapping out the connections. "They think they're building an empire. They're actually documenting a criminal conspiracy. Rodriguez, get your forensic accountants ready. Follow the money." By afternoon, the pressure intensified. Code violations appeared on resistant properties like malignant mushrooms after rain. Tax assessments doubled, then tripled. Insurance companies suddenly discovered high-risk conditions requiring policy cancellations. But Millbrook Heights had changed. The community that had learned to stand against the Reapers' violence now fought back with paperwork and procedures. Every violation was appealed with documented evidence. Every assessment challenged with professional appraisals. Every cancellation questioned with legal precision. "They're trying to drown us in red tape," Mrs. Rivera worried, watching another stack of legal notices arrive at the community center. "No," Thomas corrected her, his eyes never leaving the tactical displays showing the spread of cartel-controlled properties. "They're drowning themselves. Every legal document they file, every official action they take creates evidence we can use. They're building their own trap, one paper at a time." His phone buzzed with another threat, this one from a number he recognized as belonging to the cartel's chief financial officer. Everything has a price. Everyone can be bought. You're fighting the inevitable, soldier. Thomas's response was simple. Some things aren't for sale. Some people can't be bought. Welcome to Millbrook Heights. As evening approached, he gathered his core team around the command center's main table. The tactical displays showed the cartel's property acquisition spreading like a cancer through the neighborhood, but also revealed something they hadn't noticed. Patterns of resistance, communities organizing, neighbors supporting neighbors. They think they're being subtle, he explained, highlighting key positions on the map. Using legal means, legitimate businesses, proper paperwork, but they don't understand what they're really fighting. Officer Rodriguez studied the pattern of acquisitions. They're creating a noose, tightening it slowly. Classic stranglehold strategy. Exactly, but they've made a critical error. Thomas switched the display to show community gathering points, neighborhood watch routes, support networks that had sprung up in the wake of the Reaper's defeat. They assume we're defending territory. We're not. We're protecting something they can't understand. Community, history, home. Through his surveillance network, Thomas watched cartel operatives meeting with city officials in expensive restaurants and private clubs. Money changed hands, promises were made. The system they'd corrupted worked exactly as they planned. But they never noticed the small red lights of hidden cameras, never spotted the undercover FBI agents posing as waiters, never realized that their own meticulous record-keeping would become their undoing. The cartel's frustration manifested in an unexpected way. Thomas noticed it first in his morning intelligence briefing. Their communication patterns had changed dramatically. The disciplined, encrypted channels they typically used were being replaced by frantic, poorly secured transmissions. They were getting erratic, desperate. "Major," Thompson radioed in. "Overnight surveillance shows them moving in new players, different from the usual muscle. These guys look professional. Military-grade equipment, coordinated movements, sophisticated communications gear." Thomas watched through his network as unmarked vans delivered teams of men carrying state-of-the-art electronic equipment. Not thugs or soldiers this time, technical specialists. "They're escalating to cyber warfare," he informed his core team during their morning briefing. "They're trying to crack our surveillance network, compromise our communications." Officer Rodriguez brought more troubling news, her face drawn with concern. "They've hired a team of private investigators. They're digging into everyone's past. You, the volunteers, even our supporters. Looking for pressure points." Thomas had anticipated this phase. When money and muscle failed, enemies always turned to information warfare. The cartel was hoping to find secrets, vulnerabilities, anything they could use to break the community's resolve. "Let them dig," he told his team, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had steadied Marines through countless operations. "Every investigation they launch gives us more evidence of their coordination. Besides," he smiled grimly, "they're not the only ones who know how to gather intelligence." Throughout the morning, Thomas watched their new strategy unfold. Neighborhood watch volunteers received emails containing personal information, subtle reminders that they were being watched. Business owners found their private financial records mysteriously leaked online. The message was clear. Resistance had a price. Mrs. Rivera rushed into the command center, clutching her laptop. "Thomas, they're posting things about my late husband. Terrible lies. They're saying he was involved in money laundering, that his death wasn't an accident. They're trying to divide us," he explained, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Create doubt, breed mistrust. It's classic psychological warfare tactics, but Millbrook Heights has evolved beyond such manipulation. Instead of hiding from the exposures, residents shared them openly. Every attempted blackmail became another documented cartel tactic, another piece of evidence showing their desperation." "Major," the Martinez twins reported from their observation post. "They've got hackers hitting the neighborhood security network, professional ones, trying to blind our cameras, intercept our communications." "Good," Thomas replied, his prosthetic leg shifting silently as he moved between tactical displays. "That means they're getting desperate. And desperate enemies make mistakes. His ATF contact called with urgent news that confirmed his assessment. Hawkins, they're not just using tech specialists. They've hired a team of former intelligence operatives, NSA, CIA, private sector. These guys are good, real professionals. Perfect, Thomas said, already adapting his strategy. Because professionals leave professional trails, and I've spent 22 years learning how to follow them. By afternoon, the digital assault intensified. Security systems faced sophisticated attacks. Communication networks encountered jamming attempts. Surveillance cameras detected interference patterns. But Thomas had prepared for this. His military experience had taught him that technology was just a tool. The real strength lay in people. They think they're fighting a security system, he explained to his volunteers during an emergency briefing. They don't understand they're facing a community. Technology can be hacked. People's resolve cannot. His phone buzzed with another threat, this one accompanied by personal photos from his military service. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has weaknesses. We will find yours. Thomas's response was characteristic of a man who'd faced death in a dozen countries. Secrets don't matter when you're not ashamed of who you are. As evening approached, he gathered his core team. The tactical displays showed the cartel's digital siege spreading across Millbrook Heights like an electronic plague. They're trying to blind us, Officer Rodriguez noted, watching security cameras go dark one by one. No, Thomas corrected her, switching to backup systems she hadn't known existed. They're exposing themselves. Every attack creates evidence. Every probe leaves traces. They think they're gathering intelligence. They're actually building our case. Through his remaining surveillance network, Thomas monitored cartel operators meeting with their new specialists. Money flowed, plans were made. They thought they were launching a sophisticated cyber assault. Major, Thompson radioed. They're setting up some kind of electronic warfare center in the old warehouse district. Military-grade equipment, satellite uplinks, the works. Expected, Thomas replied, his military training already formulating countermeasures. Let them establish their infrastructure. Every piece of equipment they install becomes evidence we can use. Mrs. Rivera brought coffee to the watchers, her face etched with concern. Thomas, these people, they can find out everything about us. How do we fight that kind of power? By understanding what they don't, he answered, his eyes never leaving the tactical displays. They think information is power, but they don't understand that real strength comes from what we stand for, not what we hide. Outside, Millbrook Heights prepared for another night of digital warfare, but the atmosphere wasn't fearful. Where the cartel expected to find panic over exposed secrets, they found acceptance and unity. Let them come with their technology, Thomas murmured, watching his backup displays. Let them try to break what can't be broken. They're about to learn that some things are beyond their reach. The war for Millbrook Heights had entered a digital phase, but this time, the defenders weren't just protecting data, they were guarding their dignity. And that was something no computer could crack. The cartel's digital assault backfired spectacularly at midnight. Thomas had been waiting for this moment, watching through backup systems as their hackers breached what they thought was the neighborhood's main security network. They're in, Officer Rodriguez reported, monitoring the fake systems Thomas had set up as a trap. Downloading everything from the decoy servers. Perfect, Thomas smiled. Let them take it all. What the cartel's tech specialists didn't realize was that they weren't just downloading surveillance footage, they were installing a sophisticated tracking program designed by Thomas's own cyber warfare contacts from his Force Recon days. Major! Thompson radioed excitedly from his observation post. Their command center is lighting up like a Christmas tree. Every computer, every phone, every device connected to their network is now giving us complete access to their entire operation. Sometimes, Thomas finished, the best way to catch a predator is to let it think it's caught you. Throughout the night, data flowed into Thomas's secure servers. Financial records, communication logs, operation plans. The cartel's overconfidence had given him exactly what he needed: documented proof of their entire criminal enterprise, from street-level enforcers to their highest-ranking officials. Mrs. Rivera arrived at dawn, bringing fresh coffee to the overnight watchers. "Thomas, the news is reporting a massive data breach. They're saying we lost everything to the cartel's hackers." "Let them think that," he replied, showing her his real displays where cartel operations were being mapped in real time. "While they celebrate their supposed victory, we're mapping their whole organization, from the street corners to the boardrooms." His ATF contact called, sounding impressed. "Hawkins, this is incredible. Their encryption just collapsed. We're seeing connections to corrupt officials across 5 states, money laundering operations, weapon shipments, human trafficking networks. Your sister's town was just the tip of the iceberg." "They never understood what they were really fighting," Thomas explained, his prosthetic leg creaking softly as he moved between monitoring stations. "They thought this was about territory, about power. They didn't realize it was about justice." By morning, the cartel's celebration turned to panic. Their successful hack had compromised their own security. Every attempt to shut down their systems just spread Thomas's program further, like a digital virus designed by someone who understood both military strategy and network architecture. "Major," the Martinez twins reported from their observation post near the cartel's command center. "Their tech teams are going crazy. They're trying to purge their systems, but the more they delete, the more data gets sent to our servers." "Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a badge," Thomas observed. "It's a line of code written by someone who knows how to turn an enemy's strength into their greatest weakness." His phone buzzed with a frantic message from an unknown number. "What have you done? Do you know who you're dealing with?" Thomas's response was simple. "Now everyone will know who you're dealing with." Throughout the day, he watched the cartel's digital empire crumble. Their encrypted communications became transparent. Their hidden accounts were exposed. Their entire network of corruption laid bare for law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions. "They're running scared," Officer Rodriguez noted, monitoring police channels. "Their lawyers are jumping ship, their corrupt officials are resigning, even their tech specialists are trying to make deals with federal prosecutors." "Because they finally understand," Thomas explained to his volunteers gathered in the command center. "They thought they were fighting a neighborhood watch. Instead, they gave us the keys to their kingdom. 22 years of military intelligence work taught me one thing: the bigger they are, the harder they fall." Mrs. Martinez watched the news reports in amazement as arrest after arrest was announced. High-ranking cartel members, corrupt politicians, dirty cops, all being led away in handcuffs. "All those powerful people, all those connections," she marveled. "How did they fall so quickly?" "They built their empire on secrets," Thomas replied. "We just turned on the lights." His secure radio crackled. Thompson reporting from observation post. "Major, massive movement at their command center. They're destroying equipment, burning documents." "Let them burn," Thomas replied calmly. "We already have everything we need. Sometimes the best victory isn't winning the battle. It's making the enemy realize they've already lost the war." As evening approached, he gathered his core team. The tactical displays showed the cartel's organization dissolving in real time, their carefully constructed facade of legitimacy shattering under the weight of their own exposed corruption. "They thought technology was their advantage," he explained, highlighting key nodes in their collapsing network. "They never understood that every weapon can be turned against its wielder." Through his surveillance network, Thomas watched cartel leaders fleeing their positions, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. What started as a fight to protect one neighborhood had exposed a criminal empire spanning multiple states. "What happens now?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that had reassured countless Marines before crucial operations. "Now, we show them what real justice looks like." His phone lit up with one last threat. "This isn't over. No one crosses the cartel and lives." But Thomas knew it was over. The cartel had made the same mistake as the Reapers. They'd underestimated what a united community could achieve. Let them make threats, he thought. They're about to learn that some enemies can't be intimidated, some truths can't be hidden, and some victories can't be stopped. Outside, Millbrook Heights settled into another night, but this time there was no fear, no tension. The cartel's digital warfare had given the community its greatest weapon, the truth. And truth, Thomas knew, was more powerful than any army. As news of the cartel's implosion spread, a new energy swept through Millbrook Heights. Residents gathered in the streets, sharing stories of resilience, unity, and the power of truth. Thomas watched from his sister's porch, a sense of pride swelling in his chest as he observed the transformation. They had won more than just a battle. They had reclaimed their community's spirit. But Thomas knew the work wasn't finished. Corruption had deep roots, and justice would require more than just exposing the truth. It would demand accountability, reform, and a committed effort to rebuild what had been broken. His phone buzzed with a call from his ATF contact. "Hawkins, the Attorney General wants to speak with you personally. What you've uncovered. It's bigger than we ever imagined. The cartel's network extended into federal agencies, international banking systems. Your neighborhood was just one piece of a global operation." "Tell her I'm ready to get to work," Thomas replied, already planning the next phase of operations. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents poured into Millbrook Heights, following the evidence trail Thomas had provided. Arrests were made, assets were seized, corrupt officials were indicted. The scale of the cartel's influence shocked even the most cynical observers. But Thomas's focus remained on his community. He worked tirelessly with his volunteers, helping displaced families find new homes, assisting businesses in reopening and supporting residents in processing the trauma they'd endured. The wounds left by both the Reapers and the cartel ran deep, but healing had begun. Mrs. Rivera found him one evening in Sarah's study, reviewing rebuilding plans. "Thomas, I've been thinking. We need more than just repaired buildings and new security systems. We need to heal the soul of our community." Thomas nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "What do you have in mind?" "A community center," she suggested. "A place for healing, for learning, for coming together. We could use the old library building, the one the Reapers used to use for their operations. Transform something that represented fear into a symbol of hope." "I love it," Thomas said, already seeing the possibilities. "Let's make it happen." The project became a labor of love for the entire neighborhood. The Martinez twins, with their construction experience, led the renovation efforts. Officer Rodriguez secured funding through seized cartel assets. Mrs. Rivera poured her heart into designing programs for youth, seniors, and families who needed support. As the center took shape, so did a new sense of purpose in Millbrook Heights. The fear that had once haunted the streets gave way to determination. The isolation transformed into connection. Slowly, the community began to heal. 3 months to the day after the cartel's fall, the Millbrook Heights Community Center held its grand opening. Hundreds gathered to celebrate, filling the once-abandoned library with laughter, music, and the aroma of Mrs. Chen's famous dumplings. Thomas stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. There were the old-timers who'd seen the neighborhood through good times and bad, the young families just starting to put down roots, the volunteers who had become like family. Each had played a part in the extraordinary journey that brought them to this moment. "My sister used to say that a community is only as strong as the stories it tells about itself," Thomas began. "For too long, the story of Millbrook Heights was written by those who sought to control through fear. But today, we reclaim our narrative." He spoke of resilience in the face of terror, of unity in the face of division, of the indomitable human spirit that had refused to be broken. He spoke of the power of truth to shatter even the most entrenched corruption, and the power of justice to heal even the deepest wounds. "The battle for Millbrook Heights' soul was not won by any one person," he continued, his prosthetic legs shifting slightly as he adjusted his stance. "It was won by all of us, by every individual who refused to be intimidated, every voice that spoke out against injustice, every act of courage and compassion in the face of cruelty. As he closed his speech, Thomas's eyes settled on a framed photo near the podium. His sister Sarah, standing proud in front of her school. My sister believed in the promise of this community. She believed that together we could overcome any challenge, weather any storm. She gave everything to protect her students, to stand against those who would prey on the innocent. Though she couldn't be here today, I know she'd be proud of what we've accomplished, not just in removing the evil that threatened us, but in the ties we've forged, the community we've built, the story we've begun to write together. He raised a glass in toast, his voice ringing with emotion. To Millbrook Heights, may we continue to write a story of hope, resilience, and unity. And may we never forget the power of a community that stands together. As the celebration stretched into the evening, Thomas found a quiet moment to step outside. The autumn air carried the sound of children playing, of neighbors chatting, of life returning to normal. But it was a new normal, one built on strength, vigilance, and the unshakable bonds between people who had faced darkness together and emerged stronger. The war was over, but Thomas knew the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding trust, maintaining vigilance, ensuring that darkness never again found a foothold in their community. These were the challenges that lay ahead. But looking at the transformed neighborhood around him, he knew they would face these challenges together, as they had faced everything else. For now, Millbrook Heights was more than just a dot on a map. It was a beacon, a shining example of what happens when people stand together, fight together, believe together. And that, Thomas knew, was a victory worth any price. 3 days after the community center opening, Thomas sat in Sarah's study, reviewing intelligence reports from his network of contacts. The FBI's investigation had uncovered disturbing connections that reached far beyond Millbrook Heights. The Reaper's operation, it turned out, wasn't just about neighborhood extortion. It had been a testing ground for something much larger. Officer Rodriguez arrived with her customary morning coffee and troubling news. They're releasing some of the lower-ranking Reapers on bail. Legal technicalities. Death's old connections in the justice system are still working behind the scenes. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. They'll try to reorganize, rebuild their power base. That's why we're not waiting. He spread a map across the desk, marking locations with red pins. Every safe house, every meeting place, every potential rallying point the Reapers had used. We're not just defending anymore. We're taking the fight to them. That's not exactly legal, Rodriguez worried, her police training conflicting with her desire for justice. Everything I do is legal, Thomas corrected her, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided Marines through countless operations. We're just going to make it impossible for them to operate. Watch and learn. His phone buzzed, Thompson reporting from his observation post. 3 former Reapers at the Blue Moon Bar, looking mighty unhappy. Word is they're trying to contact their old cartel connections. Good, Thomas checked his watch. Right on schedule. He'd spent his military career studying enemy patterns, predicting responses. The Reapers' remnants were painfully predictable. First, they'd gather at their old haunts, then they'd try to reassert control through violence. But Thomas had already changed the battlefield. Martinez twins, you copy? Operation Clean Sweep is a go. Across town, carefully orchestrated moves began. Health inspectors, honest ones this time, descended on Reaper-connected businesses. Building inspectors found violations at their apartments. Traffic cops monitored their movements. Every attempt to rebuild their criminal enterprise met with swift, legal opposition. This is harassment, one former Reaper complained to Officer Rodriguez as she wrote yet another ticket for his illegally modified motorcycle. No, she replied, her badge gleaming in the morning sun. This is law enforcement. Get used to it. By nightfall, the message was clear. Millbrook Heights wouldn't be easy pickings anymore. But Thomas knew the real challenges were still coming. His ATF contact called with urgent news. "Hawkins, we've got movement. Death's brother is gathering forces down south. He's not happy about losing the family business. Intel suggests he's bringing in mercenaries. Former military contractors." "How many?" "At least 20, heavily armed. These aren't street thugs. They're trained killers with combat experience." Thomas smiled grimly. "So am I." He activated his volunteer network, veterans from 4 wars, each watching different sectors of the neighborhood. Mrs. Rivera's ham radio crackled with encoded updates, using communication protocols Thomas had learned in Force Recon. "Contact," Thompson radioed. 4 SUVs, military-grade equipment moving south on Maple. They're using standard tactical formation. "Martinez twins, you have eyes on the back routes?" "Affirmative. They're trying to set up a perimeter. These guys know what they're doing." Thomas had expected this. Death's brother wouldn't just send thugs. He'd send professionals. But they didn't know they were walking into a prepared battlefield. "Execute Operation Spotlight," he ordered. Suddenly, powerful floodlights blazed from rooftops and windows, illuminating every shadow where the mercenaries might hide. Security cameras pivoted, covering every angle. Motion sensors activated. "What the hell?" One mercenary cursed as his tactical advantage vanished. Thomas's voice carried through carefully placed speakers. "Gentlemen, welcome to Millbrook Heights. I see you brought military-grade weapons, which is a violation of several federal statutes. I should mention you're currently surrounded by multiple law enforcement agencies." It wasn't a bluff. FBI tactical teams had been waiting. State police SWAT units emerged from concealed positions. Even honest local cops tired of corruption joined the operation. "You have exactly 1 minute to surrender," Thomas continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had given similar ultimatums in war zones across the globe. After that, things get complicated. The mercenaries were good, but they weren't prepared for this level of coordination. They'd expected to intimidate a neighborhood. Instead, they found themselves in a military-style ambush. "This isn't over," their leader shouted as they retreated. "Death sends his regards." "Neither is my sister's fight," Thomas muttered, watching through his surveillance feeds. Later that night, his volunteers gathered in Sarah's living room. The Martinez twins brought pizza. Officer Rodriguez provided updates on arrests. Thompson cleaned his rifle while providing tactical assessments. "They'll be back," Thompson warned. "Men like Death's brother don't take defeat well." "Let them come," Thomas replied, his prosthetic legs silent as he moved to check the tactical displays. "Each time they'll find us stronger. This isn't just about defending anymore. It's about sending a message. Millbrook Heights isn't just another target, it's a community that fights back." As evening approached, Thomas sat on Sarah's porch, watching his transformed neighborhood. Children played freely in their yards, neighbors chatted over fence lines, and the evening air carried the sounds of normal life, the very things he'd fought to protect. Mrs. Rivera brought him coffee, settling into the chair beside him. "Thomas, what you've done here, it's more than just beating the Reapers or exposing the cartel. You've shown us what we can be when we stand together." "No," Thomas replied softly. "You all showed me. I just reminded you of the strength you already had." His phone lit up with a message from his ATF contact. "Final report. Death's entire organization dismantled. 78 arrests across 6 states. Over 200 million in assets seized. The ripple effect is still spreading." Thomas thought about the scared faces he'd seen those first days, the relieved ones he saw now. The transformation went deeper than just security cameras and neighborhood watches. It was in the way people carried themselves, the pride they took in their community, the unshakable knowledge that they were stronger together. Sarah appeared in the doorway, home from another successful day at her school. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by the confident smile he remembered from their childhood. "The school board approved our new community education program," she announced. We're turning the old auto shop into a training center, teaching kids practical skills, giving them alternatives to gang life. The best defense against darkness, Thomas nodded, is creating light. As sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, neighbors began gathering on porches and front lawns, a nightly tradition that had evolved since the community's victory. They shared meals, stories, and plans for the future. The Martinez twins were teaching self-defense classes at the community center. Officer Rodriguez had started a youth police academy. Even Mr. Chen's restaurant had become a gathering place for community meetings. "You know," Sarah said, watching the scene before them, "when I called you that first time, I was just hoping you could help us feel safe again. I never imagined." "That's the thing about community," Thomas replied. "It's like the military. The real strength isn't in weapons or tactics. It's in the bonds between people who look out for each other, who refuse to let each other fall." His secure phone buzzed one last time, a message from an unknown number. "You won this round, soldier. But there will be others." So, Thomas smiled, typing his response. "And we'll be ready. All of us." Because that was the real victory in Millbrook Heights. Not just defeating the Reapers or exposing the cartel, but transforming a neighborhood into a family. A family that had looked evil in the face and said, "Not here, not now, not ever." As darkness fell, porch lights clicked on up and down the street, not out of fear now, but as beacons of hope. Each light represented a home, a family, a piece of the unbreakable network that Millbrook Heights had become. Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them here. From those first tense confrontations to the final victory, every step had been about more than just fighting back. It had been about reclaiming something precious, the right to live without fear, the power of standing together, the knowledge that some things were worth any price. The war for Millbrook Heights was over, but its legacy would live on in every child who played freely, every business that thrived, every neighbor who looked out for another. They had done more than win a battle. They had changed the very soul of their community. And as Thomas watched the evening settle over his sister's neighborhood, he knew that this was the greatest victory of all. Not just beating back the darkness, but creating a light so strong it would never fade again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.